So, hello everyone, and thanks very much to the organisers of this meeting for asking me to present on this topic of radiation protection in space. I'll just share my screen to get my slides up. So my name is Tim Squire. I'm a radiation oncologist based up in Townsville at Townsville Cancer Centre. So my job inherently is delivering therapeutic radiotherapy to cancer patients, but I also have an interest in space radiation protection, which actually has quite a lot of overlap with our training and how we practice our radiation delivery. I'm active on Twitter, and that's my Twitter handle there. So I'll be talking about radiation protection in space using the paradigm of time, distance, and shielding as a bit of a backbone for my talk. So radio protection in space is a concept of understanding the radiation environment, and there's this constant background stream of the galactic cosmic radiation, which are really leftover highly charged particles from big explosions and leftover from the Big Bang. And it really is this constant bath of radiation, which we're largely shielded against, being on Earth from the magnetosphere, which is the diagram which you can see there. And solar particle events are these explosions from the sun, which can emanate radiation spontaneously and are largely difficult to predict, but can be related to the solar cycle. So they could have significant biological consequences from some of the evidence that we have so far that is by no means complete or completely translatable to the environment, but cardiovascular damage, which we know from radiotherapy, we try and avoid the heart as much as possible in incidental irradiation from breast cancers. Neurocognitive impairment, which we also know from treating brain tumours, and carcinogenesis, so secondary cancer risk from our job, is something that we always discuss, particularly with paediatric patients that have many, many years to potentially develop a radiation-induced cancer. So this environment, with some of the data that we have now, leads us to having to get a better understanding of how radiation affects astronauts in the future when they will be venturing beyond the protection of the Earth's magnetosphere. So this is NASA's risk reduction pathway, and up the top you can see the years there. So we're in the year 2021, obviously, and the red bars up the top indicate that there is a high consequence and lack of complete understanding of mitigation of these factors. So you can see right up the top there, space radiation exposure and cancer is something that is still being worked on for sure. Degenerative changes from radiation exposure, and the other factors are also listed there. In reality, these factors might be synergistic with radiation exposure, such as microgravity and those sorts of things. So what are some basic radiation protection principles? Really, the main one is that no radiation dose is safe, and we use the ALARA principle, as low as reasonably achievable, to get the results that we need. So it's all well and good treating a tumour with a really high dose of radiation, but not if you're destroying all the surrounding tissue. So if you can do the same job with a lower amount of radiation, then that's what our preference is. So the three main factors that we look at are time as the variable, distance, and shielding as the other two variables, which hopefully by today you'll grasp the concepts of that these are not only radio protection principles for Earth, but also extraterrestrially for astronauts on deep space missions. So the first one is time. So in our practice, limiting exposure. So obviously people leave the room when we're using our linear accelerators and only the patient is in there. If we have unsealed sources, patients have minimal interaction with staff. They will be in a hospital bed and have their food placed on a tray through the door. They'll be staying in there until the half-lives of the radioisotope have decreased so much that they're safe to exit. And also brachytherapy, sealed sources. So again, we're not in the room, and we limit the time of the exposure of the source as much as possible outside the safe when transferring it. So in the space radiation environment, if you can limit the time of exposure beyond the magnetosphere and before you get a little bit of planetary or atmospheric shielding in the destination planet, then you need to try and get there quicker. And this is where reduced transit times via improved propulsion systems may be helpful in the future. So we had a look at this with a paper that we presented, got published fairly recently. Alexander Ryan is a very bright rocket scientist based at Sydney University, and he's looking at electrical propulsion. And Samuel Bernard is also very clever biological circadian modeler with mathematics, looking at this paper of two real things, of looking at potentially torpor, which I'll talk about a little bit later on, but for this first section, looking at reducing transit time for deep space missions. So the transit time simulation was done with the GMAT and MATLAB software with the propulsion parameters that are outlined here. So we basically looked at three different propulsion systems. The first being a chemical propulsion system, a nuclear system, and electrical system. And we tried to make the three comparable as much as possible with identical weight of dry masses of the theoretical spacecraft being 21 tons across the board there. The duty cycle varies with the electrical propulsion system, obviously, and the transfer type was different as well. And you'll see this in our generated orbits that we came up with. We used two X3 ion thrusters for the electrical based system and a nuclear thermal propulsion system for the nuclear system. So this first orbit from the paper is looking at the chemical propulsion simulation, and from the point of takeoff to the arrival at Mars, after putting in the parameters into the orbital simulation, the estimated time was 258 days. Again, when we did this with the nuclear thermal propulsion system, this was decreased to 209 days. And with the electrical system, performing a non-Holman's transfer with the spacecraft, rather than firing its thrusters and coasting, which is largely what is occurring in the chemical and nuclear orbit, is that the thrusters are continuously firing. Although electrical systems have a very low sort of ability to push its way along, if you can continue doing that over a long period of time in space, you can really achieve really high speeds and then slow down right at the end to get to your destination, rather than coasting along as Y. You could get there a lot quicker, and that's 80 days in our simulation. So when we input this into the Altaris simulator for radiation dose in space that NASA kindly let us utilize with estimated wall structures of the spacecraft, you could see obviously the less time you spend, the less radiation dose you get. So 51.4 millisieverts for the electrical based system. So just a bit of discussion on those points is that, as I mentioned before, for the electrical based system, it's a nearly constant operation with impulsive, compared with impulsive rockets. So rather than firing and coasting, these electrical based systems are thrusting all the way along to go faster. There's a significant weight issue with the nuclear based system. And there's obviously policy around using nuclear propulsion in space. But a big thing is that we would require 1 megawatt of power to power our electrical-based system, which is clearly not feasible at the moment or reasonable for a spacecraft. But however, this is just a proof in principle paper for discussion. So moving on to the next parameter, looking at distance. Usually in our radiation environment, you have the inverse square law. So if you double the distance between you and the radiation source, then you can quarter the radiation dose that you get. So moving as far away as you can, and we do that through various means like mazes and bunkers, and not being in the room with patients when they're treated. But this can't really be altered in space because of the GCR, the galactic cosmic rays, is this constant bath from all directions, this isotropic dose. So you can't really move away from it. Similarly, with solar particle events, you think, well, what if you were on the other side of the sun when it exploded? And it's not quite as simple as that, because there's a complex of magnetic field lines of the magnetosphere of the sun that these events can follow along. So really, that's not really a factor that you can alter in space. But the next section you can potentially, and this is shielding. So this is what most people would think about in terms of radiation protection. Well, we use lead shielding for X-rays and all that sort of stuff, but it's more different it's more difficult in space because you can't use lead because it's very heavy, and it would also generate lots of secondary particles from these highly charged energetic particles that smash into the material and further generate a shower of particles that can increase dose to astronauts nearby. And these using materials is what's called passive shielding. And generally the best ones so far are highly hydrogenated things like water, polyethylene, and low weight, obviously for fuel requirements and launching. The other shielding technique can be active shielding. So this is using magnets or magnetic fields to deflect these charged particles, a bit like in futuristic space movies where there is a shield that the spaceship creates around itself to protect itself from radiation. And then with shielding towards the end, I'll mention some other sort of interesting biological systems that could be used for shielding as well. So just with this passive shielding material is a nice graph here by Cucinotta, who's a very knowledgeable scientist involved in the field of radiation shielding and radiation effects. And you can see the bright green line there for solar particle events, which are different to galactic cosmic radiation in what they're made up of in terms of protons and that sort of thing, a best shield with hydrogen. And you can see that polyethylene is quite good moving across there. But if you look at GCR there's not much difference between what you can sort of do with your materials, whether it be Martian regolith or moon regolith versus aluminium versus polyethylene. And graphite appeared to be a useful material, which is something that our research group is looking into, using graphene for radiation shielding protection. And we've done some work with Anatoly Rosenfeld and Stefania Paracci at the University of Wollongong, whereby we have been testing materials at HIMAC, a heavy charged ion facility in Japan, and using novel microdosimetry to assess the radiation shielding abilities of materials next to a simulated wall of the Columbus module from the ISS. And this is just a brief picture of the experimental setup with the beam entering from the left-hand side of the picture and hitting materials and having a water fountain in the middle with these novel microdosimeters to give accurate and real-time radiation readouts. So that's some of the material research that we have been doing. There's a lot of other organizations looking at things as well. And then in terms of active shielding, we recently presented some work using our MRI linear accelerator, which is a very new way of treating cancers. Usually we use a CT scan to base our imaging, but we're fortunate here in Townsville Hospital to have a linear accelerator attached to an MRI, where we can get real-time images of tumours moving and treating them at the same time. But as you can see by the title of this paper, we did some proof of principle research, really looking at the importance of optimal design of magnetic fields that might be used for active shielding in the future against charged particles. And this is just a diagram from Slough in 2018, where a dipolar toroidal arrangement of magnetic fields is trying to create a safe space within the spacecraft in the middle there, and demonstrating the charged particles that are being deflected out of the way. But what we wanted to address and discuss in this paper was that even astronauts or anything else in the way of a beam of radiation, that secondary generated electrons in our case, or charged particles in space, can be dragged along those field lines and could be counterproductive for the space habitat environment. And the way that we did this, moving from left to right, is that the bore of the MRI there has a phantom in the middle, and the large red arrow on the left-hand side is the beam that is entering through into the phantom or the astronaut. That may be the case in space. And we used some film and created some beam profiles around the perimeter of the MRI to try and assess how far away from the isocenter of the radiation is some of these charged particles being dragged along because of the magnetic field, which may be the case when you're using magnetic fields around an environment to deflect charged particles away. And these beam profiles essentially show that we were getting doses, detectable doses in the order of 3.5% what they should be, well away from the bore, in the order of meters, 100 centimeters, 150 centimeters away from the bore, not where you'd want them to go. So that, if this was a space radiation environment, it's all well and good having a strong magnetic field around, but if X-rays or uncharged particles that get through the magnetic field enter and hit anything, including your counterpart astronaut next to you, the internal radiation that might be generated can escape along these field lines and create a detrimental environment. And then just moving on to the last sort of bit of shielding, some biological shielding. Our original research was in the radiotherapy arena of looking at timing of radiotherapy and whether that improved DNA damage when patients were being irradiated in the morning or the night. And this was a circadian rhythm sort of study, which could also play significant roles for astronauts in space. So we know a lot of biological functions are rhythmically controlled. You open your eyes in the morning, your retina gets stimulated by blue light. You've got the suprachiasmatic nucleus in the brain, tells you what time of the day it is. Melatonin, cortisol, those sorts of things get released rhythmically. And DNA damage repair is under this control as well. And we know with some basic animal studies that mice with disrupted clocks can have worse toxicity when they receive radiation compared with a normal clock. And having disrupted circadian rhythm, which would be the case in deep space when you don't have lighting cues, can actually be carcinogenic in itself in a number of cancers, such as colorectal, liver, lung, and oropharynx. Sleep may also play an important role for DNA damage repair. So again, with lighting and feeding schedules would being important in deep space. Melatonin is important for radio protection, and hibernating squirrels are more relatively radio protected against their awake state. And these may also be altered with conditions of hypothermia and enduring sleep. So these sorts of considerations in terms of the importance of sleep, circadian rhythm in health, and those sorts of things are no longer sort of fringe thoughts in the scientific community, and our research had been quoted in fairly mainstream media, such as BBC Future here and Wired magazine. So research with how sleep and hibernation and those sorts of things affect radiation exposure in astronauts is not science fiction, and we know this from the European Space Agency having their hibernation and torpor research unit. And it will be important for future deep space missions that where there's no lighting cues to continue with things that are being performed currently, like on the ISS with lighting schedules and feeding schedules, any way that can tell your body when it's day and night and continue these normal functions. And moving further forward, SpaceWorks is looking into hibernation and torpor chambers for deep space transit, and there'll be implications for muscle atrophy and using TENS machines to stimulate astronauts when they're in torpor, which is essentially humans don't hibernate, so torpor is an induced state. And also feeding as well, which would have to be via PEG tubes or peripherally inserted tubes rather than eating and drinking themselves. So another factor that we looked at in the propulsion paper was induced astronaut torpor and how this might affect radiation exposure. And we looked at a number of factors in our simulation of a strong versus weak circadian clock, a light exposure, looking at dark versus light-dark cycles, and body temperature of 37 degrees versus hypothermia versus even lower temperatures. Such may be the case as in induced torpor state. So we ran 20 simulations or 20 runs for each combination of 200, for a total of 240 simulations with around 60 dividing cells. And each cell was represented by two models, so the circadian clock and the cell cycle. And the body temperature parameters, we used a single temperature dependent parameter. And it's quite a complex mathematical process that Samuel Barnard went through, which the more details of which are in a supplementary data of the paper, but these were essentially the main variables that we used. And in a table form, this is what we came up with. So what we could see overall was that with a decrease in body temperature, there was a relatively higher healthy to total cell number ratio when we were running these simulations, which kind of makes sense because you cool things down metabolically in the medical setting at the moment for those that have cardiac arrests or even cerebrovascular events. You cool down patients to limit the cellular damage that's occurring. And this is obviously the case, the same with radiation protection as well. And the other thing that we noticed denoted by the box is that the greatest number of healthy to total number of cells was achieved when the simulation was the coldest and the circadian clock was the strongest. So there's obviously interplay between the circadian rhythm in the body, its response to radiation damage, and the temperature at which this is occurring. So it would be all well and good cooling people down and putting them in a torpor state, but it would be important to maintain their circadian rhythm somehow. So just some discussion points on this. The torpor conditions are starting to be investigated with temperature management, cooling, using drugs, and even shallow metabolic suppression. You know, we can think about what happens to animal circadian rhythm when they hibernate, and this is mixed from species to species as well. We have no idea what happens to humans when they're put into this induced state. How is this maintained? You know, I mentioned the lighting and feeding schedules, and it's probably some individual variability. The study's showing that there's a large difference between gender and also age as well. So we're sending older astronauts to Mars, are we sending males, are we sending females, that sort of thing. Cell cycle advancement. So the circadian rhythm controls the cell cycle in a very regulated fashion, but irradiating cells might reset these cells. So when you go into a dividing state, into a senescent state, so it's a complicated thing. And then habitation on planets. Now, on some planets, including Mars, where the atmosphere is dusty, the blue light might be filtered out, which is a significant cue for us as humans when it's daytime. Distance from the sun, a similar sort of thing. Living underground, so no light cues. The length of days, particularly on distant planets, is going to be largely different as well. So perhaps to have a normal circadian rhythm, or continue a robust circadian rhythm along with these feeding and lighting schedules, you know, the retina may need to be stimulated by blue light, which might be a difficult thing when eyelids are closed during these states, but this is just some sort of forward thinking that our group's been thinking about. So really just some closing thoughts is that the paradigm, the radiation protection paradigm of time, distance and shielding isn't something that we look at here on Earth in the medical field for radiotherapy or nuclear disasters or nuclear workers and that sort of thing, but can also apply to extraterrestrial applications, getting there quicker, getting better shielding materials, trying to understand better analogues for what happens with the radiation. And it's going to be important for us to understand and mitigate this risk to astronauts for these future space missions. So thanks very much for listening. And I, again, thank the organisers for the invite to talk today.